live. It is Friday, December 4th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. It is a misty, rainy day in Washington. What kind of day in Cape Cod is it?
It's like the same. It's gross.
What about in Irvine, California?
Are you in
So I
Irvine?
am
You're
not
not.
in Irvine, California. I'm actually in Washington, D.C. right now.
Oh,
So I'm getting
I
the same weather that you've got, Ben.
I thought you broke into the MoMA and like are posing in front of one of their installations.
yeah. So
I,
let's
I
start with the
travel.
wallpaper, dude,
Yeah.
because
So awesome.
that's some weird
I
ass
travel
shit.
with Ai Weiwei artwork, and wherever I am, I just post it. No, we're renting this place, and they just happen to have Ai Weiwei's golden age here. It's pretty impressive. It's kind of intense. I
It
wouldn't
is
call it.
it is really super intense. I've never seen it I've never looked at it for so long. I've seen it before, but the
Yeah.
handcuffs really like, kind of
Handcuffs,
really make it.
surveillance, Twitter. But it's almost like he took, he took maybe he took one of my reports and just created artwork around it. I mean, what's interesting about it in some ways is I think it's like 5 or 6 years old. And if you think back to 5 or 6 years ago, the conversation around Twitter and surveillance was governments were using the tool, right, in order to surveil users and so forth. And that's still happening. I mean, that is still happening in a big way. But the conversation is so much different, Kate, as you know. I mean, now we think of Twitter as sort of the governing authority, the new governors, right? It's just the conversation has flipped around quite a bit.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. You should have, I mean, if you do a second edition of Speech Police, you should see if you can license this. It would be truly excellent.
I should. It was the one thing the book was missing.
Wait, there's something really important that we haven't said, which is that we're not allowed to have fun anymore.
Oh, yeah.
But in lieu of fun, we have David Kaye, who is, I think the game is going to be how many special repertoire jokes we can make in 1 hour. The special repertoire for not being allowed to have fun anymore.
Yeah.
UN special rapporteur. So Kate, why don't you introduce David?
Yeah. David Kaye I should start by we have had on the show now, David, I think almost everyone who was at that Stanford meeting, roundtable at Hoover. It was, it's just kind of really funny because that was such a great group and everyone keeps talking, and then we kind of go into it, but that's how I met you for the first time. And David is a professor of law at UC Irvine and an expert on speech. And you're a clinical professor. So which I actually wanted to talk to you about what that's looking like right now. But then, and you are the author of Speech Police, which is behind me. And you are you are the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. And so why don't we start off with that part? Because I think everyone understands the professor part probably, and maybe even the clinician part, but I'm sure that there's some people who don't understand what it is a Special Rapporteur does.
Yeah. So thank you for inviting me. I mean, I want to
What are you drinking?
I do want to, I didn't have time. I have really plain old water right now, but I'm going to have a beer afterwards.
Okay.
That's cool. Sierra Nevada. I drink California beer mainly. So if that's okay, just to maintain that California quality. Well, so special rapporteurs are appointed by the UN's Human Rights Council, which is the central human rights body of the UN system. It's a part of the General Assembly. And they basically monitor different human rights issues around the world. And so I was appointed in 2014 to monitor freedom of expression, free speech issues, dealing with things like protection of journalists. It quickly moved into speech in the digital age, the intersections like this wallpaper. I guess I have to go this way. The intersection between speech and privacy, those kinds of issues. I reported to the council, conducted visits around the world, did reports on those, did big reports on different particular issues. And so that's what a special rapporteur is. It's cool to have in your title special. You know, I just have to say that was nice, but I'm not special anymore.
Are there any non-special rapporteurs? I mean, the word rapporteur, at least as I understand it, only occurs in the English language with the words UN special in front of it.
It seems to. It's true. There's no just, I mean, there are
ordinary
rapporteurs.
For
yeah. There's no formally ordinary.
Boring rapporteurs.
Yeah.
Always special. Everyone's special.
They're all special. You're special too.
Yeah, but I'm not a rapporteur.
Even if it's not in your title.
It's not like, mine is sort of like, you know, just boring old normal senior
Rapporteur.
fellow.
Yeah, maybe it should be special senior fellow. I mean, you can do it. You have power. You have power. Yeah. So that's what we do. I mean, and a big part of the role is, you know, taking issues that people deal with around the world and think of through their own domestic law environment and put them into the context of international human rights obligations that all states have. And that was a lot of what the work was about for 6 years.
So what is, broadly speaking, the state of freedom of expression worldwide looking like?
When you last saw it.
Yeah, exactly.
Your wallpaper aside.
The wallpaper aside, I mean, it's grim. It's pretty grim out there. I mean, the first part is that, I mean, your audience, and you don't need to have me tell you that with authoritarianism and authoritarian populism on the rise, a big piece of that has involved attacks on civic space, right? Attacks on the media, attacks on journalists, on activists. There are, you know, sort of continuing jailings of journalists, but also like we see in Egypt over the last couple of weeks, right? The attack on the Egyptian Institute for Personal Rights, the EIPR, where they are like the most kind of middle of the road, excellent human rights organization in Egypt and one of the top ones in the Middle East. And the government of Sisi has gone after them, you know, basically for the kind of reporting that they do. And that's I think, typical of what we see around the world. So it's, from that perspective, it's pretty grim. On the other hand, you know, there's a lot of awareness, partly because of social media, of the power of having voice. And so whether it's governments or companies that are interfering with that voice, I think people are a little bit more alive to the ideas and the value and the purpose of free speech norms. So it's, you know, it's a little more complicated than just saying it's all bad out there.
Yeah, but like, so kind of, can we, so I'm, okay, I don't know where to start. I feel like there's an American exceptionalism that kind of saw the internet and Silicon Valley as bringing, and you talk about this in Speech Police, but that saw itself as bringing kind of freedom of expression kind of writ large to all of these communities. And it's partly kind of the story around the Arab Spring. As we know now, maybe the Arab Spring wasn't quite as lasting a revolution as like we might have liked, and all of these other things. But nonetheless, it was this idea that we were kind of the free states were bringing like the fear states, this kind of like this level of freedom of expression with these platforms. I feel like the narrative has changed to be so anti-big tech now, especially in the US. This hatred for Facebook, this hatred, and like maybe less for Twitter, but like and YouTube and like big tech generally. Mm-hmm. But like, I was just in a call the other day, and there was this woman kind of saying, like, it was like a call for the oversight board, and there was a woman from the Philippines kind of just talking about how everyone's being censored and all of the reporters are being censored by the government in the Philippines. And the only way around it is that Facebook is putting things back up and allowing them to route around kind of some of these issues. Mm-hmm. And that was, you know, like, is it just the moment that Americans are in and kind of the myopia that Americans are in around big tech right now? Or is it kind of larger? When you go out and you talk to people around the world, is there a much different perspective that you get about what tech is providing versus the harms that it's providing?
Yeah, it is such a great question. And I guess I would say that there is as much as people differ around the world, there is a shared kind of, I'm not sure I'd say hatred, but a shared feeling about Facebook, but it comes out in different ways. And that shared feeling is both concern, resistance to the power of Facebook, and so forth. In the United States, I think it's really actually quite different from what you have in, say, a place like Thailand, right? Where the concern is Facebook is taking down posts about the royal family because the government of Thailand says, you can't criticize the king. There's a lèse-majesté law, right? In Thailand, you can go to prison for many years for violating that law. So there's a different attitude towards Facebook. It's that there's a desire for Facebook to protect them. And I actually mentioned this point in Speech Police, where, despite, like, I spend many pages talking about all the concerns around Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, but I was in Cambodia and we had a driver. It was a family vacation. We had a few days in Cambodia. We were near Angkor Wat. And, when you drive around Cambodia, you see everywhere you go, you see these massive portraits of Hun Sen, of the leader of Cambodia. And I asked our driver, what do you think of him? And he just sort of went off on him, like, very negatively. But, there's pretty much only state media in Cambodia. So I asked, how do you get your news? And without missing a beat, he said, Facebook. And he gets his information from Facebook. So I think the concern that many people around the world have is that the debate in the United States, which is very different from the debate in Europe, which is a debate that's a little bit around alienation toward the platform, like this big American platform having control of European public space. That's very different from the debate in Southeast Asia, where there's like massive control by government and individuals want the space for engagement. It's not the only space for them, but it's a pretty central one for them.
Whose complaint? I mean, when you look around the world and evaluate the center of gravity of different populaces' complaints about the platforms, which ones strike you as having the most and the least merit? I mean, let me give you an example. Yeah. I don't have a lot of patience for the European complaints about American big tech companies. They seem to sound mostly in protectionism, and then they impose these data privacy, protection regimes that don't actually meaningfully restrain their behavior. So the product Facebook under the GDPR is not meaningfully very different from the product Facebook not under the GDPR. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, what you're describing about the complaint in Thailand, which
or Cambodia,
is very similar to the complaint that Egyptian activists make
True.
A lot, strikes me as really powerful and mm-hmm. damning. And so I guess I'm and then there's the American complaint, which is of course muddled and quite different depending
Definitely
on who
muddled.
you're talking to, right? It's they let foreigners affect our elections except when they're discriminating against conservatives. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, we have this incredibly muddled discussion of it. So I guess my question is, who are you sympathetic to in this conversation?
Yeah. So
what team are you really on now that you're not with the UN?
Yeah. So I think it's useful to separate all those different things. I mean, Facebook is so massive and it's so powerful in so many different places that it doesn't really make sense. I mean, there are actually two elements to this. On the one hand, it doesn't make sense to talk about one Facebook in many respects. It's just a different product put to different uses in many different parts of the world. It still remains an activist's tool or just an individual's tool for information in a pretty fundamental way in authoritarian environments. Yep. In that respect, Facebook, and not just Facebook, but all the platforms, I think, need the support of governments in the West, let's say, to push up against that kind of repression. But that is really different from, as you say, like the attitude or the product, let's say, in Europe. And I differ a little bit on this. So my sense from many Europeans is that a couple of things. One, there's a sense that this company several thousand miles away and an ocean away in Menlo Park that's made rules that have basically been marinated in a First Amendment concept of freedom of expression is making rules that governs a big chunk of public space in Europe today. And what's more, I think many Europeans in governments, including people in law enforcement, they feel like, whereas they have a difficult time reaching Facebook, and we're just talking about Facebook, but this is true for all the platforms, they have trouble when they have a real problem, like maybe it's extremist, whatever extremist means, extremist content that they're concerned with, they have trouble reaching out to Facebook to identify like who can help them with that content. And their sense is that their American counterparts in, say, law enforcement don't have the same kind of problem. So there's that kind of alienation, I think, in Europe that isn't really just, oh, it's this American icky thing, like just another McDonald's or Coca-Cola, and we don't like it. I think it comes from a genuine sense that this foreign company dominates their public space. Whether that's totally true or an overstatement is almost beside the point, because I think what Europeans are really trying to do right now, and we see it this week in this European Democracy Action Plan. We're going to see it in the Digital Services Act, which is going to be introduced in the European Commission or by the European Commission probably in 10 days or so. What we see is the, basically European government actors responding to just the power of the platform in a way that Americans, as you said, Ben, like are muddling through or have a muddled conception of what the problem is. They're trying to figure out, I think, in a pretty thoughtful way what the problem is, if there's a real problem.
Yeah. So that was a great question, Ben. And it also kind of like your comments lead to something, which is like, I want to know, okay, so I completely agree with you that like, basically this is not Facebook as McDonald's, and there's just like a base like cultural grotesqueness or disgust with like kind of this like imported thing and like this new way of doing something. But I would only say that that's an issue of scale, because I do think that there is kind of like, I think that like there's something that happens because of the information that the platforms fundamentally changed the information ecosystem of basically the entire world. Mm-hmm. But as you said, I think it's because it's governance, because it's something so fundamental. It's like, and it's all happening in Silicon Valley, and it's such a huge market. So it's like all three of those things, but I would kind of stress maybe the market. Like Europe doesn't have a single platform the way that like Central Asia does, or like even South Asia does. Some of the platforms in South Asia, like they've never developed something like that, and they've been left out from a fiscal standpoint of a ton of revenue. I mean, you're just starting to kind of see it with like all the tax changes that Ireland made in the last decade, like trying to kind of get a piece of that or something, but that's just through a labor market, not through creation of its own like kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of curious if you think like something like the GDPR was like an attempt at kind of seizing back power in that regard as well, not just over kind of like, but like forcing themselves into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think part of it, although GDPR is massive and has so many different elements, and it wasn't initiated as, fundamentally a concern over social media, right? I mean, it became, in a way, actually, search was a bigger issue for many Europeans than social media. And I mean, if you go back to Schrems and Google Spain and all of those different issues, like those were much more, I think, fundamental than social media. I think one of the interesting things, so first off, I totally agree with you on the fact that one, Europe hasn't developed its own sort of model of a social media that would be tenable. And that may have a million different reasons behind it, but it is unfortunate. And at the moment, if Europe wants to develop that, they're going to have a really hard time if they create rules that are so onerous that only the big companies have the resources to self-regulate under them. So that's, I mean, there's a real dilemma for them. But I do think that there's this power issue. And one of the things in the GDPR that is, I think, is paradoxical about the whole thing is that it has it's given Facebook and others an argument for less transparency, like an actual legal argument about less transparency. So while transparency is essential for Europeans and Americans and others around the world to understand what's even happening on the platforms, I think now the platforms are turning around and saying, look, we'd love to be more transparent, but how can we be more transparent if that results in the exposure of private information or the use of private information that the GDPR precludes us from doing? Now, I think that argument goes too far from Facebook sometimes and is precluding some research on the platforms, but it's a real issue. And it's a suggestion in a way that the GDPR has had some unintended consequences that maybe, like the DSA and some of these other new proposals, are going to try to kind of peel back. I mean, not by repealing any part of the GDPR, but deal with it in some other ways.
But this is a great example of how just like people are like, hey, I know what I'll do. I'll make 140 character like machine that like just kind of tells people, can tell me what they had for breakfast and like what their dog is doing and like whatever, what their boss just said, like, and it takes off and no one could foresee all of the crazy kind of externalities that would cast off. Like the same thing happens with policy. People who would have foreseen that like the GDPR would become a weapon against transparency? I mean, like maybe you could have seen it, but like that wasn't like one of the primary, like, I don't know, that was not a foreseeable.
Yeah, completely. It wasn't foreseeable. And also, I mean, the GDPR, like everything that comes out of Europe, was a very lengthy, laborious process. And, social changed a lot during the time that the GDPR was developed. And so, and it's, I mean, honestly, it goes all the way back to Section 230, which is, I mean, I don't think we want to make this like a Section 230 hour.
Oh no,
but
we'll make it a Section 230 hour.
I mean, who wouldn't want that? But when you've got these, well, I'll say two things. One is when you've got these rules that have been fundamental to the development of, what we think of as today's internet, and yet those rules were developed in an era when not that many people had the foresight to imagine what was to come. That's you're going to lead to some really weird and unfortunate results. Yeah, that looked like the one finger intervention rule.
Or no, I was just thinking I would have bet. I am surprised that Section 230 hasn't had more negative externalities. Honestly, like I think that it's like, I mean, I think that it's a huge, like, I agree that like there needs to be change, but like I'm kind of shocked that more stuff hasn't fallen out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're at the point now where people are looking back at this old law and they're debating it. And we in the United States, look, it's the responsibility of our public leaders who have, I think, in a bad faith way, driven an understanding of Section 230. I mean, I think at least a big chunk of the discussion is completely bad faith. I don't even think that is much of a controversial statement.
Wait. You mean that the president is not in good faith when he suggests that that he might veto the NDAA if it doesn't repeal Section 230 because it's causing harm to our election integrity and national security?
Oh,
Are you
well, when you put
suggesting-
it that way,
are
when
you
put it that way, Dan,
suggesting
you're right. I may have misspoken.
that statement is not, you know, dripping with intellectual merit?
No, you're right. It has some merit. I guess I'm more concerned.
Never thought about the intellectual merit dripping, and it kind of made me want to like stick
oozing off of it,
oozing with merit,
seeping out of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of oozing. So you know what? The thing is, it's been across the board, and it predates Trump's interest in Section 230. When you go back and look at any of the hearings on this, for the last 3 or 4 years, those hearings on content decisions by the platforms, they're extremely politicized. The people on the congressional side look like clowns. Oftentimes, they're not prepared. They're driven by the politics rather than what they actually want to solve. And in each of those hearings, almost across the board, the company people come off looking like measured and sober and wanting to solve the problem. That may not actually be true, but that's what it looks like. And so, and you compare that. There was actually a moment a couple of years ago when a member of parliament, it was a parliamentary committee from the UK, came to the United States to conduct part of its hearings. You might remember this. Must have been like 2 or 3 years ago, led by Damian Collins. And
yes, I do remember this. And yeah, people wouldn't appear, right? I think the CEOs refused to appear.
CEOs wouldn't, but the content policy people.
Yeah, like Nick Pickles, I think, was there from Twitter, and like there was like some people.
It was like Nick, Juniper Downs.
Yes.
From Google, and Monica Bickert from Facebook. Like they all came. It was great. The conversation, the questions were like at a pretty high level of specificity, like pretty professional and knowledgeable. And it doesn't mean that when the UK develops its Online Harms Act, probably early next year, when they probably present something, that it's going to be a great piece of legislation. But, the conversation isn't nearly as, frankly, ridiculous as it is in the United States.
Mr. Zuckerberg, will you fix my email? Like, I know.
Yeah. I mean, it's
my
crazy.
My phone doesn't always work, and I think it's the liberals' fault.
Libtards. No, for sure. God. No, for sure. So, but stepping back, I think that we're sort of in this moment on the platforms where, on the one hand, there's a lot of change that needs to happen. It's like got to be transparency. There has to be much more understanding of how they're making rules and what rules they adopt and all of that. But one of my concerns is that we lose sight of the fact that there are some places, and maybe even in the same places where there are serious concerns about them, that they are providing, voice for a lot of people. They're providing an opportunity for people to both access information and share it that they wouldn't otherwise have. And we should be thinking about that while we're thinking about the other stuff,
So switching gears, talk to us about the clinical the clinic that you run at UC Irvine.
Mm-hmm.
What is the nature of it, and what do you guys work on?
So law schools have, like, over the last 30 years, like every law school has a clinical program, right? I mean, if you're going to be, and students want that, right?
Because they need the COVID tests.
Yeah, right. So they're frontline defenders in clinics, right? They're actually doing that work. So, there's both the demand for students, certainly after their first year, to do some practical, on-the-ground kind of work and training. And I think students love that kind of work. At UCI, we have a whole network of clinics. We also teach doctrinal classes. So although I teach a clinic, I also teach federal courts and international human rights law and stuff, and international law, stuff like that. So we do a mix of everything. The clinic that I teach, we call it the International Justice Clinic. And for the last 6 years, we did a lot of work within the UN system. I mean, a lot of the reporting that I did, the travel, we did fact-finding missions to Turkey, to Tajikistan, to Mexico, to Liberia, Ethiopia. We had students actually staff those kinds of missions, in part because, the UN doesn't have a lot of funding. it's not that expensive to go to a lot of these places, and we were able to get that kind of work funded. So we continue to do that kind of stuff. I mean, the end of my mandate with the UN coincided with COVID. So I think, as anybody who teaches anything knows, I mean, everything was virtual. So I don't think what we're doing now is necessarily representative of what the clinic is going to look like into the future, because we ended up doing a lot more, amicus filings, a lot more work that didn't require external fact finding.
That's so interesting. So I have a question. Given the fact that that's like the context in which your students are, like outside the United States is the context in which your students are seeing a lot of the free expression work being done. Do you see them have, what are their perspectives on the problems of big tech? Do they see a huge dichotomy between I just feel like all of the anger around big tech, but then you kind of go places and you do see that Facebook is the but-for cause to all, dissidents having their reporters, having their voice and all of these other things, or people getting their news.
Yeah. So on that part, I mean, we've talked about it. I don't really want to overstate it because, and the reason why I'll say exactly a year ago, I was with 2 students and an officer from the UN, from the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. We were in Ethiopia for almost 2 weeks. And, what we heard from people in Ethiopia, which you could imagine, given what's been going on in Ethiopia over the last couple of weeks, but also over the last couple of years, is that what we didn't hear really was, Facebook is this great place for the sharing of information and expression and so forth, or debate. What we consistently heard from civil society and from government was that Facebook was a place for, and YouTube, that there were places for, the incitement to violence, to ethnic hatred, to highlighting difference in a country that was coming out of a really severe repressive, 20, 30 years, and needed to have a sense of nationhood. And people were really upset with that. And in fact, at the beginning of this year, the government of Ethiopia adopted a hate speech and disinformation law that is deeply problematic. But it was because it was driven by this concern over hate speech and disinformation. So, my students, I think, see this like many of us do, which is it's complicated. It's a place that can be useful for expression and so forth, but it's also a place that can be, problematic. I feel like we had a little chat roulette going on here.
No, it's just when I bring in people from the audience to ask questions, they momentarily appear on screen before I banish them to the lower left, and then I bring them back when
That's a lot of power.
Well, I used to just leave them up on the screen. Fairly. Yeah. I used to not banish them, but then Alice Lee complained that she got self-conscious just sitting there on the screen while people talked. And so the audience decided that they should be banished to the lower left and be invisible until we were ready for their questions. So in the spirit of transparent democracy, I adopted a policy of banishing people to the lower left, which sounds harsh, but in fact is what the audience wants.
The people wanted it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're a populist in your own way.
I am a populist. I just give the people what they want.
Yeah.
And
so wait, we have Mike Godwin.
Let's bring on Mike Godwin.
I know.
I saw Mike pop up there for a second, and then he got banished.
Hi, Mike.
He's back.
Hey, I wasn't banished. I was preparing my remarks.
Preparing your remarks.
Yeah, no, I always have a lot to say. It's good to see you, David, by the way.
Hey, Mike, nice to
I
see
love
you
your
too.
wallpaper, too.
Yeah.
So my question is really, I did a bunch of work for Freedom House and for Internews and for the State Department doing basically this country-focused free speech on the internet projects around the world. So I've worked in 20 different countries. It's all very exciting, but it used to be that every country had its own problems. But now it seems like every country has the same problems, which are that, governments discover that people, they think they're going to be like Hun Sen. My wife is Cambodian, and I met her on one of these projects. But they think they're going to be like Hun Sen and have millions of followers, right? And then what they do is they get online, and then people don't like their postings, and then they put those people in jail, and they want Facebook's help, right? And this problem just recurs over and over again. So I'm wondering, given that there seems to be some global harmonization of anti-free speech efforts on the internet, what can be done globally to, tactically or strategically to fight back?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And it's also a question that, Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu wrote about this, like before most of us were talking about it, which was, in their book must have been like 2007 or 8, Who Controls the Internet? I mean, they said, right, states are going to come back. They're going to fight back for control. And we think of the internet, like, before 2010 as this borderless thing. That's not how governments see it. And so, like, the pushback from governments isn't surprising. I'm actually chairing the Global Network Initiative now, which is this, multi-stakeholder. It's like companies and civil society and academics and investors who are thinking exactly about this problem, right? How do you support freedom of expression in an environment where there's so much pushback against private actors? Like, what can private actors do? What should we expect the private actors to do? What should we expect the platforms to do in response to demands from governments that are, very specifically interfering with the platform's users' rights? Like, what do we expect them to do? And so, I mean, I do think that there needs to be support for what the companies do in pushing back against that. The Global Network Initiative has principles on freedom of expression and privacy that the companies actually commit to, and that's important. But they need support from others, and I don't think they often see that support. And certainly, the environment today is such that, to even step up and say, I support Facebook in X country right now, like, that's like, people aren't doing that. We need to find a mechanism to make that happen. I mean, I do think, to answer Mike's question a little bit more specifically, there has been a lot of this in the UN system, in the human rights mechanisms. There's been a lot of, I would say, reinforcement of the constraints that governments have under human rights law, so that they don't use the platform in order to, for example, to jail people who dislike a tweet by Hun Sen or whatever it might be. So, although there's no dislike button, I know that, but you know what I mean.
Which is one of the great design flaws of Twitter, by the way.
Well, the whole emotional control system is, but that's probably another show.
I think the fact that the only thing you can do on Twitter to show reaction is it's like in 1984, where they talk about how if you reduce the number of words, you reduce the capacity of thought. Mm-hmm. And so the only emotional reaction is like.
Yeah.
Whoa, Kate, you're muted.
Muted.
See, I reduced Kate's capacity for thought.
Yeah.
No, I love that. I haven't heard someone compare that, like, make that exact comparison between the like buttons and only having a like button, and then like the
there's a very explicit
1984 thing.
There's a very explicit conversation in 1984 about it, where the one of the functionaries who's later vanished. Is describing how he's removing words from the dictionary in order to reduce the capacity for thought. Yeah. And every time I think that the only emotional reaction Twitter lets you have, and Facebook was, until recently, was even worse, their only reaction was this.
Right.
It's not even like love, or it's not even an emotional reaction. It's a hand gesture that represents some very sort of generic approval. Now they have a range. They have 5 or 6 hand gestures, things you can, like a fire or something. But I do think there's something there.
I think that's right, but I do think, I mean, this is an important part of the entire business model of the companies, which we're not talking about, which is, that's what generates the engagement, the attention, and it's a real problem. It's a design problem, but it's also fundamental to the way these companies operate.
Yeah, we have to go to Eve's question, but I have something to follow up with that afterwards. Hey, Eve.
Hey.
I was in disguise.
What?
You're in disguise.
Sorry.
I'm joking. I didn't.
Yeah. So, I was wondering if we should value the diversity of understanding of free speech and encourage every country to keep their own way of regulating free speech, or should we should move towards a more globally acceptation of the free speech?
That is such a great question. The platforms want, one set of rules because at scale that's easier, right? And so my kind of tweak of that is, and this is what we talked about at Hoover when I got a lot of skepticism from on this, was that the rules should be human rights law rules. I mean, these are the rules that, first of all, First Amendment makes no sense to most people around the world. We should love it and value it and all that, but it just doesn't make sense. It's not the vocabulary that people use around the world. Human rights law is actually the vocabulary that people use. And it's also a flexible set of norms, because it's flexible in the sense that Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says everyone shall enjoy the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. And then it provides bases for, government to limit that. But those limitations are pretty narrow, but they're flexible. And they also, I think, would respond to the kind of situation we have today where people, they don't want it to be a free-for-all for harassment and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and hate speech of all kinds. They don't want that. And human rights law gives you the power to do that, and it speaks to people. So the problem, if I could say, is not really, I'm not as sure the problem is a problem of rules anymore. It's a problem of enforcement. And the real problem is that whatever the rules you have, you're always going to have a problem of context. And the platforms are so big that they have very little insight into the language, the code that people use in all of those different places where they're operating around the world. So I think people think, well, if you had one set of rules, you might end up with content that is kind of flattening the world. And I actually don't think that's the necessary outcome. You could have one set of rules that are rooted in human rights law. And because context is different, that doesn't mean that cultural norms should necessarily change things, but it does mean that there's context that explains why this word in Sweden, might just be something people laugh at, whereas this word in Ethiopia is actually, a cause of incitement to violence. But, there's very little insight into those difference in language and the use of language and the political situations in which language is used.
So one of the things that I think that brings up is this kind of question that happened at the Hoover thing. I think it's much more that, now looking back at the conversation that we had and the things that I disagreed with about your paper when you first was that you were using the international human rights norms as shoulds of a top down type of approach of imposing some type of whereas I think I have always thought of norms in the context of the internet and language and all of this stuff as being very bottom up cultural social norms context. And so I think it was that kind of that was kind of what I was saying. I didn't see a future in which Facebook or any one company imposed one set of rules or norms on the entire world without there being tons and tons of friction and there being lots of issues. That's
but the companies need rules, right? I mean, nobody would be happy if they didn't have rules. So, and that's why it's such a joke, the discussion over Parler and and other platforms is that those places will all have rules, and they do have rules. It's just like where you draw the rules. So, actually, I'm not on Parler. I don't know anything about how it works, but it's actually, it's a good thing if there's a proliferation of platforms, each with their own kind of rules. That also there's a freedom of expression of the companies to design what they're about and what they're involving. Like a platform for dogs and dog lovers may not want to have, cat lovers invading that space, right? I mean, I'm joking, but there's always going to be rules. Yeah. But and it's a question of for these massive companies, what that means for enforcement of them in all of those different places. And I don't think that they have reached a point where they're doing that effectively.
No.
Whether they can is really an open question.
Yeah.
She was supposed to come over to Shea Wittes for a drink on the patio after In Lieu of Fun, but that got rained out. So I told her to come on In Lieu of Fun and ask a question instead. Hillary Hurd here with dramatic lighting. Your question.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm sorry. I know it looks like I'm in a bit of a cave. I have one of those apartments that has absolutely no overhead lighting, so it
looks like you're
struggle.
in a Kevin Abosch photograph. Actually, it's awesome. I like it.
Yeah, good. Well, it's always a struggle in the Zoom era, I think. Thanks for coming on, David. I've read a lot of things you've written, and it's I find a lot of your commentary so inspiring on all these speech issues. My question sort of dovetails with what Eve, I think it was asking, which is about global norms of free speech. And, I'm excited by this idea, which I think you obviously seem to be as well, that the ICCPR could provide this blueprint for global tech companies faced with very tricky global content moderation decisions. And it seems like every tech company in some way gives a nod to that argument, but doesn't necessarily really do that in any meaningful way. And so I'm just wondering to what extent your optimism about the value or the ability of companies to actually implement the ICCPR in their content moderation decisions, the extent to which you've sort of maintained your optimism or lost it, or if you have any concern that major tech companies essentially ignoring the ICCPR or acknowledging it but not acting upon it might actually weaken the ICCPR as sort of a normative body of human rights law globally. Yeah, that is another really awesome question. And I think that is a risk. I mean, it's definitely a risk it's a risk for the body of law of the ICCPR, for human rights law, for international norms generally, if the companies adopt these rules and then ignore them, because then, it takes away from their credibility. I'm optimistic on a couple of fronts, but I'm pessimistic on others. So I'm optimistic. First off, I think the human rights obligations of the state of the companies, or let's say human rights responsibilities, because it's only states that have the obligations. So for the companies, I think that it has to go beyond just the question of whether particular content is lawful or not. Human rights law talks about issues of transparency, of accountability, of appealability, right? I mean, every right has a remedy. There's all of this that's built into human rights law that I think the companies can do. It's actually hard for them to do it, apparently, because even though they've been increasing their transparency in some ways, they're failing at the granular level of really explaining what they do. Maybe the oversight board will provide a little bit of a trigger for better transparency. Too early to know. But I'm a little bit optimistic on some of those features, and also on the due diligence side. I mean, companies should be and can be, before they introduce their product to a market, they should be evaluating what's the human rights implication of doing that. But I do think that, again, this goes back to enforcement. I think that if they continue to adopt rules and yet they're unable to truly, genuinely enforce those rules in places where they don't have real understanding of context, that's going to be a problem, because people won't necessarily blame that on an enforcement problem. They'll blame it on the structure of the rules. And that goes to your question, or to your point, that there's a risk of undermining the rules themselves.
Laura, I don't even want to try, because I could get into the land of like an unintentional ethnic slur without even working on it. Laura, it's good to see you.
Sorry about that. I changed my last name to add my Twitter handle, but it
and then it cut off the rest of the last name, and I just didn't want to say what it appears to read.
Sorry.
Your question. It's good to see you.
Well, I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about the firing of Timnit Gebru. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her name. I'm sure you are familiar with her work. She's a very prominent AI ethics researcher. For anyone watching who doesn't know, she was just this week fired / forced to resign from Google, and it looks like a really disturbing example of a company trying to censor a researcher's work. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know all that much about it apart from what I've read from both Timnit and her account, I mean, on Twitter, and the response of I guess Jeff Dean, I think, at Google. I don't know much more than that, but I mean, I would say I know her work, and the work is amazing and has been extremely influential in the area of AI and the possibility or the probability of AI, particularly the way data informs AI, but also the development of AI tools as being a form of bias, of not just kind of integrating bias, but also expanding it, promoting bias, and other things. So, I don't know the details behind it, to be honest, but the fact that someone like Timnit is unable to stay at a place like Google could be telling, and is really unfortunate. I mean, I certainly hope that and I expect that she lands in a place where her research can be valued and and promoted. It's unfortunate if what was actually happening was, kind of a sense that it wasn't being promoted, and also that within the context of the work environment in Google, that it wasn't as open to diverse ideas and research. That's at least the impression that one gets from the exchange, and that's really problematic.
Matthew Allen. By the way, I just want to say to all of the people who are asking questions for the first time, or you haven't done it very often, who are stepping up today, really great. And to everybody who are regulars who I'm ignoring today, because you don't take it personally. You guys are usually the only people in the Q&A. This time we've got an embarrassment of riches, and I'm availing myself of it. So you know who you are, and I am in fact ignoring you on purpose. And don't take it personally.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. My connection's a little spotty, so hopefully you guys can hear me. All right. First of all, I want to say I'm a grad student at UCR, so got the SoCal connection going on.
Yeah.
So my question is, what are your thoughts regarding what is appropriate discourse in college classes? Specifically, what type of speech should be shut down, and to what extent are controversial devil's advocate arguments useful for critical thought? And what is their place in college classes?
So, gosh, that is such a super question. That's
obviously really hard question.
Totally hard question. I'd love to hear what you think about it, Kate, too, as somebody in the classroom a lot. I mean, I think, so actually my last report, if I can self-promote a little bit, my last report to the General Assembly was on the topic of academic freedom. And if you look around the world, I mean, I think Matthew's asking a question that's pretty specific, maybe to the American academic environment, but not necessarily. But around the world, we see academic freedom under assault with the rest of freedom of expression. And so my view is, first off, there needs to be autonomy for institutions, right? Institutions need to make their own rules. institutions and academics need to have the ability to develop their own, kind of academic space in the classroom that is a space for learning, and it shouldn't be guided by external political concerns. I mean, it should be guided by a search for, for knowledge, which is, fundamentally, that's what the classroom is about. Should there be restrictions on that? I mean, obviously, my basic view is no, but that doesn't mean that academics, scholars, teachers don't also have to be alive to the context of the classroom, to know, what kind of language in an environment in which, language is constantly changing and its meaning is changing, that we have to be alive to the impact that our words have on the ability of students to genuinely learn. So, but I don't think any of that should be driven by administrators or by governments. And that's a real problem that, we see it around the world. And, if you look at some of the work that the FIRE.org, go to the FIRE, the work that they do, you see that this is a real problem on American college campuses, whether it's in the classroom or in the context of, campus events and protests. Obviously going back to Berkeley and Milo Yiannopoulos a few years ago raises the same kinds of issues. My view is there should be expansive space, but we also need to be, giving as much space to academics, to teachers to, frame their environment.
Yeah, I'm thrilled with that response. I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and frankly, I have been very hesitant to get into this because, as a person as a young scholar without tenure, I think that it's a very fraught kind of thing to weigh in on. And as you kind of point out, you're okay with you don't think administrators and you don't think government should be deciding these things. But what we're seeing in American college campuses is in fact kind of group rule, group mobs, and social kind of impacts and social shaming, being the thing that shapes the behavior around free speech. I think that we're in a period of kind of huge norm adjustment in general in spaces online, and then I think that that's being reflected in college campuses a lot. And I think that those have always had a special space for speech because of the kind of the truth-seeking nature of higher education, and because the sanctity of being able to explore different ideas. But of course, some of those ideas can have harms that are unanticipated. So
yeah. One other thing I would add, I thought that's a great response, Kate. And I would also add that, universities, and there's variation between undergraduate and graduate levels, but universities are basically, certainly, I would say this is especially true at the undergraduate level, are places where, academics or teachers should be involved in teaching students how to gather knowledge and how to think critically. Fundamentally, that's what should be happening on college campuses. And so I think teachers have to keep in mind how they frame the environment to encourage that. And to me, that's the main goal. Whatever the topic is, whether you're in, teaching genetics, which can be fraught also, or you're teaching history, whatever it might be, I think it's how do you develop those critical thinking skills for your students?
And critical thinking can be uncomfortable, but it shouldn't be so uncomfortable as to be harmful. Totally. Right. And there's a difference between those two types of things.
Yeah.
So
Michael, you get the last question.
Good to see you, David.
Good to see you.
Number of us on this call have been involved in United Nations activities over the years, from the Internet Governance Forum to the Secretary General's digital cooperation effort, ITU meetings and WTO meetings. You were one of the brilliant people in an organization that has a number of brilliant people, but also has a lot of really mediocre people. So can you provide some lessons learned on how to get things done at the UN, and maybe some insights onto how these mediocre people got into their jobs? I mean, even some of the special rapporteurs that are, temporary appointments are just not very impressive. They're not special.
Now they're special, Michael.
Special.
You can't say that.
Well, David is extra special, but I'm saying some of
I used to be special. So how do
you do it? How do you maintain specialness among the ordinary?
How do you deal with the normies? Tell us.
I actually think that the system as a whole is a really good system, and basically Americans, activists around the world, should be active in it and push it. And it has some basic problems right now, like real difficult problems. Like the biggest problem in the human rights system in the UN right now is that, and I know every conversation about foreign policy tends to turn to like, what is China doing? But the truth is, in these systems, China is a big player, and what they're aiming to do, I mean, with others, is also change the way we think about human rights norms. It's a big deal. They're trying to change the normative framework of human rights law. And I think that we could have one or two responses. Like one response is, oh, there's so many violators in these places, so many abusers, we shouldn't engage because they have no credibility. My view is engage, fight, take it over, be political about it. So don't be politicized, but, actually get into the mix. This was one of the problems with, the Trump administration leaving the Human Rights Council. You can't fight in that system if you're outside it. And so there was a sense that there's this old New Yorker cartoon where everything can be explained by New Yorker cartoons, where it's a sushi chef who is standing next to a giant squid, and clearly, the customer has asked a question, and the chef says he thinks he can do more good working within the system. And it's true. So my plea is for people to work in that system, to try to change it from within. I tried to do some of that, but I also think the system has the fundamentals to be a pretty good system for normative development that applies worldwide.
I share that optimism, David. Maybe not with the UN, but generally, with the UN, but with all systems, I think that if you try in good faith to work within them, it might take a long time and be frustrating and uncomfortable, but it will eventually. Well, this is, by the way, why I think that it's important to be semi-uncomfortable in learning environments, because I do think that when you go into the real world, you are, of course, if you're going to be doing the great work, the hard work, you're going to be having to fight with people and totally. Say things, and hear things that make your blood boil or really hurt you or you think are terrible. And so having that fortitude is important. So.
Agree.
We are going to leave it there. David Kaye, thank you so much for joining us and expressing yourself so freely.
I did. I really enjoyed it. This is great.
It wasn't fun. We don't have fun here.
We don't have fun on this show.
But you should go have a California beer.
I have a Sierra Nevada in the fridge. I'm gonna open it up right now.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So, Kate, guess who we have on the show tomorrow?
You and me. Just you
and
me.
Us. Because it's Saturday.
Saturday.
Cool.
And that will be 22 hours and 56 minutes from now. And until then,
we don't have fun anymore, but at least we have international human rights.
You do.
Yeah.
Kind of.
At least we have an ever decreasing capacity to express ourselves freely.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man. That's dark, Ben.
The
Thanks.
residue of free expression. Yeah. Thank you, Dave.